Good morning. I'm David Goldman, Deputy Editor of Asia Times, and I'm deeply honored today to host Professor Scott Kennedy of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. That institution requires no introduction in the United States, but for those of you listening from Europe and Asia, CSIS is without doubt the premier, most respected, authoritative source on international strategy and economics among Washington's think tanks. Having been director of research at a couple of Wall Street firms, I can tell you that when you talk about soliciting advice from the Washington policy community, CSIS is always one of the first institutions you think of, and in the case of China, it's always the first. Dr. Kennedy is the trustee chair at CSIS and the institution's leading China expert. So there's really nobody more authoritative we could tap for their views on China at a critical moment. Deeply honored to have him with us. Now, recently, Dr. Kennedy published a powerful and, I guess, in-your-face essay called, under the title, How America Lost Its Way, the way, of course, being Huawei, which argues forcefully that America is going to lose the tech war with China if it continues in the present policy direction. That stirred a great deal of waves. With his kind permission, we republished it on the Asia Times site, and that's really our subject for today. Scott, you wrote, and I quote from your essay, "China is accelerating its infamous indigenous innovation strategy like never before. China's chip industry is still several generations behind, but it is more likely to advance when deprived of external supplies. Rather than crushing China's high-tech designs, U.S. actions are fueling them." Now that's a wake-up call to the American policy community. Could you elaborate on that?
David, thanks for hosting today's program, for giving my essay a little bit more life, and for having this discussion at a very important time. I really enjoy being in Washington and at CSIS. We do have some other fantastic colleagues who I work with, Bonnie Glazer, Jude Blanchett, and others. Actually, now everybody is a China expert in Washington. You have to be the same way. A few decades ago, everyone was a Soviet expert. And it's that type of community that I really enjoy being in. And I think even though there's a lot of hot air and frustration about Washington, I think there's actually a lot of really good work and thinking still going on, even if it's not always reflected in everyday policy. But nevertheless, it's a very vibrant place. The piece that I wrote on Huawei and the broader discussion was really raised in the context of a growing chorus of views calling for U.S.-China decoupling. That the risks from China are so high, so difficult to manage while we remain engaged, that radically reducing our connectivity, particularly in tech, but also in trade and investment, in people-to-people flows, is absolutely necessary for American national security and to actually protect the American economy. I think that's too pessimistic a view about the America's ability to mitigate these risks while having a relationship with China. I totally understand it. Xi Jinping's China is not your grandmother's China. Well, maybe it is, because our grandmother's China was Mao's China, but it's not our mother's. It's not the reform era China. It really is moving in a much harder line direction on politics and economics, much more assertive internationally, and it needs to be stood up to. And the previous policies of patient integration didn't work. that we tried for several decades, given the direction of China. So we needed something different. But decoupling is not the answer. And I'm, as I said in the piece, and I'll say again, I have no illusions about Huawei and its relationship with the Chinese system and its ability to help Chinese state with surveillance domestically and internationally. But I don't think that the goal which the Trump administration is set upon now, which is essentially crushing the company, is the most effective strategy. I think it, as you just pointed out, the likely consequence of the current strategy is to propel China to triple down on indigenous innovation. Made in China 2025, which everyone is familiar about, at least as a bumper sticker. The proposal was, let's raise China's place in global supply chains. As a result of what the US is doing now, I think China is revising its plans to say, you know what, we can't depend on global supply chains at all. We actually need to internalize almost all of that. And so we are, I think, doing great disservice to American national interests by the approach that we're currently taking. And so the piece lays out an alternative, what I call principled independence, about a way to try and mitigate the vulnerabilities that we face from Huawei and China's tech drive in general.
Now, under the current rules, the United States has asserted a very unusual extraterritorial privilege requiring foreign companies like Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation to obtain licenses from the Commerce Department to sell chips to Huawei and other companies if they're made by U.S. equipment. And the worry, of course, on the part of many people in the semiconductor industry is that this will simply encourage the world to de-Americanize their supply chain. We may have advantages in key aspects of the semiconductor design and production process now, but if we place these kinds of burdens on Taiwan, South Korea, the Europeans, the Dutch who make lithography machines and so forth, eventually people will find substitutes and our advantage in the world economy will deteriorate. What's your take on the risks to American technological standing in this?
I think that's true, certainly over the longer term. Certainly right now, America has pretty close to a lock on key elements of semiconductor equipment manufacturing and tools. And this is what gives it the leverage to assert its power, not just on American firms, but on other firms that use American equipment, because there aren't sufficient substitutes right now. And I think the American policy expects that, yes, over some time, eventually the Chinese and others may get around this American dominance. But if we can slow them down a few years, we'll be better off than if we just do business as usual. I think there's a middle ground there. And I do think that what they are going to do is gain short-term benefit, but pay very long-term costs as a result. I do think that there's something legitimate to say about American technology. If that wherever American technology goes, that export controls, I think it's justified for the U.S. to say, we don't want our technology to help create our strategic competitor, help its military. We don't want that technology used for human rights abuses. I think that's entirely legitimate. I just don't think this is the most effective way to go about trying to restrain China's growing military prowess or restrain the expansion of domestic internal surveillance in the security state. So I think it's not necessarily a disagreement I have with the goals of a lot of American policy, but the tools, which I think end up propelling China's high-tech drive, reducing the U.S.'s dominance and its credibility. And at the end of the day, I think what's most important to me is to protect market democracies and the liberal international system that strengthens them and gives them a place in this world. And I understand that sometimes you have to, fight fire with fire, and you have to go in the back alley when you're facing folks that don't pay attention to rules. But you have to remember, we have to remember the type of world that we're trying to protect and what's effective in protecting it. And so I'm not saying at all that the US should lay down for China, or that anyone should. We should fight as aggressively and as smartly as we possibly can. I just don't think that all out unilateral sanctions and decoupling are going to get us to the goal that we want.
Now, there certainly are areas of strategic rivalry. They may be the dominant issues in US-China relations. Surely there are areas where cooperation is possible. For example, many researchers in the medical field point out that China's vast access to medical data, digitized health records, sequenced DNA, studies of epidemiology, make it the indispensable go-to place for many critical areas of medical research, pharmacological research, epidemiological research, and so forth. Every European pharmaceutical company now has a joint venture doing some kind of medical AI in China. And in April, there was a letter sponsored by the Asia Society, signed by several hundred former officials and people in the policy circuit in Washington, many of them associated with the previous Democratic administration, saying that we should find ways to cooperate with China, for example, on healthcare medical issues. Are there issues where, apart from all of our differences with China, there's room for cooperation?
Of course there is. Of course there is. And the US and China should cooperate. However, where I differ, so I think the piece I think people have highlighted that I differ from the hardest, sharpest line in Washington, calling for decoupling, containment, doing this unilaterally. But I also don't think that we can have unconditional cooperation with China. And I don't even think we can have unconditional cooperation in areas where it's important to cooperate, even in healthcare. I think our cooperation with China needs to be predicated on certain principles. And those principles have to defend and be consistent with the values of market democracies. And so, yes, I do think that we should engage with China on healthcare issues, on addressing the pandemic, on climate change, on lots of things. But I don't think China should get a free pass on its system, which is a threat to our economy and to the liberal international order. I do think that we should have some principles for that cooperation. And if the Chinese are able to abide by those principles, then I think that cooperation works to our benefit. But I don't think that unconditional engagement, unconditional cooperation is to our advantage. It gets us short-term benefits in the same way that the other extreme gets us short-term benefits of just unilateral pressure. But I think something in the middle, what I call principled interdependence, where we interact with the Chinese based on principles, where if we can abide by those principles, if we can mitigate the risks, then we allow that and encourage that engagement. I don't think, for example, that we should collaborate with the Chinese on medical issues unless they're willing to share their data the way we share our data. Unless they're as transparent as we are, unless we can be assured that they apply the same types of ethics to privacy and patient rights that we apply to them. Just because China's got a lot of manufacturing and is, a lot of research on medicine doesn't mean that we should cooperate this regardless of what the Chinese do. So I think what we need to do is encourage that type of cooperation in making it consistent with the type of norms and principles that we value.
Let's talk for a second about American policy. At the National People's Congress meeting in March, China announced, if memory serves, $1.4 trillion of government subsidies for research and development in frontier industries, which is certainly a lot more than anyone else is proposing to spend. Back when I was, a young lad during the Reagan administration, I believe we spent something like 1.3% of GDP on federal subsidies for R&D, and at the time, every component of the digital economy emerged in some directly or indirectly out of a DARPA Defense Department subsidy. Now, if I think those numbers are down to about half relative to GDP in terms of federal support for R&D. The semiconductor industry circulated a bill asking for $25 billion of government support. We haven't heard a word about that. Senator Schumer, Congressman Mike Gallagher, a number of others proposed a tech subsidy bill, I think for a couple of $100 billion over 10 years under the name Infinite Frontiers. That got some publicity, dropped out of sight. What is the United States prepared to do in terms of spending its own resources to counter what is evidently a massive effort by China for technological superiority in a number of game-changing industries?
Yeah, well, certainly the discussion in Washington has shifted a lot over the last few years. Generally, the U.S. is quite allergic to anything like industrial policy. It just violates our sense of the free market. And it's the high road that we take in interaction with other countries to say you need to abide by free market principles and adhere to your commitments and limit your subsidies, mercantilist policies, and I think the U.S. has a very vibrant innovation ecosystem. Investors, researchers, educational institutions, open borders for smart people to come here and study and to work. And so that has been the strength of the American economy, and why it's developed high tech so successfully. But the challenge of China is really made Washington think twice, and as they've watched China's manufacturing capacity expand dramatically, and it move up the value-added chain in a variety of different technologies, from electric cars to telecom equipment to medical devices to robotics, to become more prominent in AI, to have big projects in quantum, blockchain. China's just about to come out with its own digital currency. These things really are making Washington reassess its overall view about how to promote and support innovation. I think actually a big turning point was a report issued in February of 2019 by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who in that report really was the first member of Congress to really clearly lay out a rationale for greater American investment in tech and industrial policy. And it's been picked up by members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I think that's why we've seen a whole spate of legislation and activity around supporting American high tech, about onshoring. And that is picked up in the wake of the pandemic. Certainly in this Congress that is about to conclude in December, over its 2 years, they've introduced over 370 pieces of legislation, including a whole bunch related related to China, including a whole bunch related to industrial policy justified on the China threat. I'm concerned. I do think that greater government support of some of these key industries would be helpful on the R&D side. But American overall R&D spending is still higher than China's because there's so much R&D spending from the corporate and side and from research organizations in universities and elsewhere. What I think is still missing in the American conversation is about how to diffuse technology, how to make sure we get the technologies that we invent into the marketplace and then to as wide a part of the market as possible. The US has a huge digital divide. You just look at during the pandemic and the number of people who don't have access to broadband, who can't go to school online. That is replicated in many instances in the United States. So economic inequality in the United States is reflected in the insufficient diffusion of technology broadly. And that is a huge hindrance to our economic development. I think as important, if not more important, than whether or not we are inventing technologies. So we need to better scale them up and diffuse them. I think that's the part of the conversation that Washington needs to put even more attention on now.
Scott, you're in Washington. You're much closer to the political process than certainly we are at Asia Times and most of our readers. Let's talk about the elections and possible outcomes. Right now, Biden's ahead in the polls. Biden has talked in fairly general terms about actions to improve investment in American technology. He's talked mainly about clean energy, but not only clean energy. He's also been extremely critical of the Trump administration's tariffs against China, which he said have hurt us more than they've helped. Let's take the scenario where Biden is in fact sworn in as president at the end of January. What do you think might, if anything, might change?
So it's a great question, and I think everybody wishes they had a crystal ball so they could figure out where things are going. But one of the benefits of democracy is that you can't predict the outcome of political contests, and so we will have to see what happens on November 3rd, or what is happening every day now, as Americans are already voting in the millions. But in any case, should Vice President Biden win and come into office in January, I think there'll be some similarities with the Trump administration's China policy, but also some big differences. We don't have a lot to go on because the vice president in his speeches and in writings has only talked about China in very general. And so, but you can try and dig down a little bit, you can prognosticate a little bit. I think in terms of the similarities that we'll see, I don't think anyone should expect that you would see a return to the halcyon days of 10 and 20 years ago, where the US and China really were primarily cooperating on a wide range of issues and had blocked and boxed off those areas of disagreement, particularly, for example, regarding Taiwan. If you remember, after 9/11, the US and China really put aside a lot of their big differences so that the US could focus on the war on terror. And there was, that's around the same time as China joining the WTO. And really, the differences were minimized, even though they were significant, and probably the U.S. should have paid more attention to what the Chinese were doing, but it was distracted by the war on terror. In any case, I think now there's a consensus in Washington that, broadly speaking, even though there are important areas to cooperate, China is viewed as a challenger to the United States and the liberal international order. And because of what it's doing domestically in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, with the growth of the surveillance state, more assertive foreign policy, still engaging in mercantilism despite the trade war. And so I think that is the sort of a competitive relationship is still primarily going to be how China is viewed, even under a potential Biden administration, going on what the vice president has said in public. That said, And I also would say that some of the tools that we've seen the Trump administration use, whether it's about export controls, investment restrictions, et cetera, I, I wouldn't expect all those things just to magically disappear on January 20th or 21st. However, I do think that we should expect a broader shift in American foreign policy. And that broader shift in American foreign policy ought to mean a different, give a different meaning to how the US interacts with China and the significance of it, type of tools US would use. I think Vice President Biden, based on what he's said and written and his actions as vice president and a senator before, show that he's largely an internationalist, believes in American leadership stepping forward, believes in alliances, believes in multilateral institutions, and we should expect a revival of American leadership internationally and greater attention to multilateral institutions. Some of those are general purpose multilateral institutions like the UN and WTO, but I could foresee greater attention to regional institutions or institutions with closed memberships, where there's really a support for building coalitions of like-minded countries around critical issues such as technology and data and other issues. So that doesn't specifically answer precisely what he would do on China, but he's not really been very precise about that yet. So, but I think I'm trying to suggest what the broad term would be: some continuity, but also some significant changes.
Before we go to listener questions, I'd like to ask one sort of big think picture about the world economy. Recently, we sponsored a webinar with the Chief Technology Officer of Huawei, Paul Scanlon. I've known Paul for some time. I interviewed him at some length for a recent book. And Paul says in so many words, people think of Huawei as a handset company, as a carrier business company, a provider of 5G infrastructure. But what we really are is an artificial intelligence and big data company. The way he put it, as I published in my book, was that the control point in the world economy today is the porting and storage of data to make it accessible for manipulation and analysis. If you think of the 20th century, where oil was the great control point and wars were fought over it and strategies were adjusted to it, today the great resource, the fuel for the artificial intelligence engine that's supposed to power the fourth industrial revolution, that's data. How do you use the mechanism of controls to counter that kind of strategy, to be a leader in data and data manipulation? What kind of policy could respond to that kind of strategy on China's part?
Sure. That's really interesting what you said about your interview, and it's extremely important. The last time I visited Huawei's campus a couple years ago and took the tour, they told me that Huawei was not a data company, it is a pipes company. It created the pipes on which data moved, and it allowed others. It created an opportunity or platform for others to engage in AI and the analysis of the data. But they had a whole variety of different mechanisms, from, trying to, smart cities, safe cities, medicine, et cetera. So they created a bunch of those the physical hardware infrastructure that would be an opportunity for others to do it. So I think they're shifting and evolving in how they identify themselves over time. Partly because of market opportunities, partly because of the U.S.-China rivalry. I think the U.S. And the West has fantastic innovation ecosystem, and are leaders in big data analytics and AI. Certainly, the Chinese have invested a ton. A lot of the development of China's AI ecosystem is a result of interaction with American universities and companies. Microsoft's AI facilities in China actually helped develop a whole lot of China's initial entrepreneurs in AI, and a lot of the companies that you see now in China, the unicorns and smaller, these entrepreneurs got their start working for Microsoft and other Western companies. And so China's success actually, like in AI, is just like in many other industries where there's been collaboration. And so I think there's no reason why the US and the West can't continue to be leaders in AI and in big data. And I think the Chinese will as well. They've got a ton of data, a lot of smart people developing algorithms, and the ability to bring forth applications quickly, scale up fast, and that's extremely impressive. At the same time, I think we also need to think about what is going to be ethical, effective, consistent with our values, and also build credibility amongst consumers, patients, the users of data. We've seen with the pandemic that if folks don't trust a vaccine, they're not going to take a vaccine. So you can't just innovate the tech. You have to build credibility in your data, in the provision of that technology. And I think that's where China's the weakest. And I think it's where the US and the West need to be extremely careful. So I really think that we need some type of huge global initiative on data, whether it's an international data treaty or building the management of data into a variety of different international agreements. We really need much greater rules and clarity about privacy, about the relationship between data and national security, the rights of states to access data, and limits around that, the appropriate uses of data in artificial intelligence, rules about where data is stored and its transmission, rules about the content over data and censorship. I think that is all about patients' rights. We need much greater standards globally on all of these. That, I think, is a foundation for anybody, whether it's the Chinese or the Americans, to really be successful, so that a fourth industrial revolution is beneficial for society.
That's fascinating, Scott. Has anyone published a draft treaty or produced background research? Is anyone in the State Department scribbling away at something on this? Do you see an initiative like this coming through in some concrete form in the next couple of years?
I don't believe that there's any initiative about a single type of treaty like I've just named. There's components of it. If you look at, for example, the Prague Principles, right, or the Prague Proposals, which are about certification of telecom equipment and trusted computing. You've got that. You've got a whole variety of suggestions about AI, principles over AI. You've got efforts about privacy taking place in different localities within Europe. You've got GDPR. The Chinese have actually been developing their own privacy regulations. That conversation continues in a variety of forms in the United States. The WTO has a negotiation ongoing of about 70 countries on trade, digital trade. So you've got different organizations, countries, communities tackling the digital economy from different perspectives. I think, just my personal opinion, there could be a benefit to putting that all together. But I'm less committed that it has to be done one way or another than that we make progress on all of these different elements relatively soon, and in order to make sure that our technology capacity doesn't get ahead of our social needs and responsibilities.
Thank you. Before we move to listener questions, I'm required to give you a brief word from our sponsor, Asia Times. Please subscribe. We, like almost all of our competitors, require reader subscriptions to continue to provide you the quality of news and analysis that we work hard to do. So we very much appreciate your support. Please do subscribe. Now, for those of you who have not found it already, there is on your Zoom screen in the center a Q&A button where you may type in your questions. Simply because we have too many people on the screen, I can't let you ask them directly, so I'll ask them for you in the order that I think most appropriate. And the first question is a simple one. What's going to happen with Taiwan?
Well, I think bottom line, I don't expect there to be a war over Taiwan in the immediate future. And so I think that's the first thing that we ought to say. Certainly a lot of tensions around Taiwan, but I don't see armed conflict occurring anytime soon. I think there's a larger question about Taiwan's future and its place in international society. I think what we've seen in the wake of the pandemic is how successful Taiwan has been at responding to this challenge, at the same time protecting a vibrant democracy and open society. At very few cases, and they've dealt with the pandemic in an extremely innovative way. And despite I think folks have a hard time understanding the unbelievable success that Taiwan has had in building societal trust. If you remember, you had the KMT and its troops and everyone, essentially move to Taiwan or invade Taiwan, take over Taiwan in the late 40s in the wake of the Civil War, and a huge division between those who were already living there and those who had arrived, and extreme tensions and conflicts, very sad situation. But Taiwan's evolved into a democracy, and there is an amazing amount of social cohesion in Taiwan. Obviously, a variety of differences and things, but full scale, comprehensive healthcare system, educational system, infrastructure, and it's Taiwan today is amazingly successful. When Secretary Azar visited recently, to talk about health cooperation, the primary thing he should have been doing was taking notes about how Taiwan had been so successful in handling the pandemic and bringing those notes back to the White House and saying, here's a blueprint for what we should be doing.
Yeah, indeed.
So, yes. So I think that, but nevertheless, getting back to the original issue of the day, that our program centered around technology, Taiwan is also a tech powerhouse in chip manufacturing. And it has big customers in China, Huawei, and many Chinese tech firms, and many American customers and others. And it is really on the front lines of this US-China rivalry. And there's a big question about, can Taiwan work on both sides of this rivalry? Or is it going to have to pick sides? And if it picks sides, you would think that it's most likely, China is a monster market, but the US is as big a market. And so I think one of the challenges that we have is trying to figure out how we can continue to have arrangements where Taiwanese firms may need to diversify from China. 40% of Taiwan exports go to China, and that's probably too high. And they need to diversify supply chains and customers and things like that. But Taiwan's economic rise has been associated with China's economic rise. And so I would expect that to continue. So the big challenge is, which I think is even greater for Taiwan than it is for the United States, is how do you continue to have extensive economic interaction, particularly in high tech, where the demands for trust are even higher than when you're making sneakers and toys. Yet the political and military challenge is even greater, particularly under Xi Jinping. So there's no simple answer to that, but but I'm still optimistic that we'll able to find some type of solution in a way that protects Taiwan society.
Thank you. A listener asks, fast forwarding to 5 years from now, what's your base case scenario for the U.S.-China trade relationship and how it will shape the contours of the global economy?
Yeah. I think that the base case would be, let's assume that despite our hopes and that Xi Jinping really doesn't change course, right? That he gets a third term in office, and that he continues to double down on his approach, and the United States shifts from sort of a unilateralist full-scale decoupling strategy toward working with allies through multilateral institutions, but keeping in place a variety of restrictions because we can't get much positive response from the Chinese. Then I guess my base case would be that that hopefully by 5 years from now, it won't continue. We won't be in this continual downward spiral where we're worried about what's going to happen the next day. But I would expect strategic stability, but with still trade in a variety of non-strategic goods and investment in non-strategic areas, but a reduced footprint in significant areas of technology. Still, though, significant financial interchange. It's amazing that despite all the restrictions that have been placed on technology companies in different areas of tech, and the radical reduction in the numbers of tourists, students, and workers traveling, that financially the U.S. and China are as coupled as ever. So I expect to perhaps some strategic stability, a smaller U.S.-China direct bilateral economic relationship in some areas of tech, some diversification away from China, but not a fundamentally fragmented world or a world in which China has been totally isolated.
Thank you. Personally, I would be thrilled if President-elect Biden were to appoint you Secretary of State, Scott, but in the case that doesn't happen, the listener would like to know who you think is most likely to be the new Secretary of State.
Well, I can tell you for sure, there's not a chance in the world that I would ever be offered that kind of position, and for anybody. I'm not anywhere near qualified for that type of position. CSIS is an awesome place to work, as I said at the very beginning, and I really enjoy it. And it's a great perch and to watch how policy is made and to contribute to the conversation. I was a professor for 15 years, and I really like that. But CSIS and working in the policy community in DC and think tanks is really super fantastic. In terms of who, it's really hard to say. I mean, there's names of people who are associated with the vice president's campaign, and we see their articles published every now and then. But for how for any individuals and the overall process is really complicated, and I actually have to turn down the opportunity to speculate about specific individuals, because I could think of a couple people who might be possibilities, but there's probably 10 to 20 times that number who are qualified and who could be under consideration and deserve to be. And so I'm sorry that I can't speculate on that and satisfy the questioner's wishes.
I knew that was unfair, but
that's okay.
Had to. Another listener asks, what are the implications for U.S. companies in China if China decides to retaliate for U.S. actions against TikTok, Huawei, ByteDance, ZTE, and so forth?
Sure. Well, um, so far the Chinese haven't retaliated a lot. They have actually done the opposite. They have tried to provide a significant amount of reassurance to American companies that are on the ground in China. Uh, they, I hear from my business friends that they have more access than they've had in years with central and local officials. They're feeling the love right now. Nevertheless, it's certainly possible that the Chinese could eventually turn. They, uh, the U.S. could do something that really is the straw that breaks the camel's back as far as the Chinese are concerned, or they're going to test a Trump 2 administration early or a Biden 1 administration early to try and set a new tone. The most likely thing that the Chinese have suggested is their own unreliable entities list, akin to the U.S. entity list that the Commerce Department maintains, that would that if you get placed on that list, you could face a whole variety of problems in China, from your business being suspended, investigations regarding your finances, corruption, a whole bunch of different things. And they have finally come out in the last month or so with a regulation with general guidance about how the unreliable entities list would work. But they've not suggested any type of any names of companies that might go on it. Although there's a rumor mill, right? But I think having this list and the hint is really what they're trying to do. They're trying to get everyone to be worried about it. The implementation of this of placing an American company or two on it would probably defeat their goal, and they want folks to stay in China, not feel that everyone is vulnerable, and so I still think that it's quite possible they won't put any individual companies on this list, but they could more likely just simply launch investigations of companies for for monopolistic behavior or other types of anti-competitive behavior that they, as a justification for putting pressure on them. I think those things are certainly possible in the coming months. But I think the U.S. needs to be concerned about what it's doing, not just because it might invite Chinese retaliation, but because of what it means for people's views about American credibility and the system that we're trying to build, and whether or not it actually gets positive response from the Chinese. So even if the Chinese are not, taking it to any individual American company, their massive increase in investment in these industries and trying to build, everything from the hood ornament to the tailpipe is something that we want to avoid. That's, to me, as big a danger as picking on any individual company.
Thank you. Here's a question. I think the following is a really important question. Listener asks, if the Chinese people don't view privacy as important as being as important as people in the West, why should a Chinese company like Huawei need to follow the standard of privacy required in the West, particularly if they're dealing with Chinese customers? And the implication of the question, I think, is that there really are profound cultural differences between the United States and China, and that expectations of privacy are different. Is it therefore incongruous for us to try to apply our standards of privacy to a radically different culture? That's a question from a Chinese.
I appreciate the question, and I think the view of the CCP, of the Communist Party, yes, is that the needs of the state and the party trump those of individuals in China. But I think when you talk to Chinese people, they don't agree with that. There is actually a really important privacy movement amongst Chinese. And I lived in China I have plenty of Chinese friends. Uh, Chinese don't want to just sort of sacrifice all of their rights to an oppressive state. So, for example, if you look at over the last several months, the Chinese have rolled out these apps that tell you, whether or not you have COVID and whether or not you can travel. Sort of a healthcare checker app. Alibaba, Tencent have had them. There may be other companies, and Chinese have grudgingly put these on their phones, but they've only done so grudgingly. They don't want the state inside their phone looking at every element of their life, even though they've had to make that sacrifice on many occasions. So I think sort of what the current policy is in China isn't necessarily what Chinese people would prefer. I also think that we ought to not overstate how privacy is protected in the United States. The US has really no comprehensive protection of digital privacy rights, like Europe does, much stronger. GDPR, the US has no equivalent to that. And most of us who have cell phones and work online, live online, we are sharing our data essentially unrestrained with the companies who provide the apps and for us. Facebook to Apple to you name it, to Google. And so, if the U.S. We may individually and as a society talk about privacy rights, but we're far from protecting them the way we need to. So I think actually, despite this supposed cultural difference and real cultural difference in some ways, there's a lot more that the U.S. can do to protect privacy rights. And certainly the Chinese need to. And I think greater, I don't want to impose any type of American or European rules on the Chinese, but if they want to do business with me and have access to my data, then they need to, I think it's fair to say they need to protect the data the way I would want it to protect the data. I think, David, you and me and everyone listening today, we should own our data. And we should have to, we should assume that anytime we are online, that any interaction that we do, any creation of data because of that, that data is ours and not someone else's. That's not the way things currently are. And I think that we need to come up with global standards, and Chinese can participate in that conversation about how to best protect our ownership of our data. And I think until we do that, we're going to have a lot of tensions and conflicts internationally and between states, between individuals and companies about data. And I think that's handling that challenge as important as pushing back on any individual Chinese company or Chinese initiative.
Okay, we have a question from a European listener. Please explain to me, how does preventing TikTok or other Chinese companies from doing business represent your high ideals of a free market economy?
Sure. Well, I'm not opposed to TikTok and Tencent doing business. I haven't suggested that, but I do think free markets ought to have consciences and ethical behavior. I mean, we don't encourage corruption even or criminal activity, mistreatment of patients, or abuse of customers. And so what healthy markets need healthy rules. And we don't want to encourage and support censorship or states abusing our data. And so now that Chinese companies are operating internationally in data, not just by providing the pipes and telecom equipment, but also the content and regulating the content, I think it's fair to say, if you're going to operate in the United States, that there should be some type of reassurance to the U.S. government and to U.S. consumers that they are treated ethically as they would see it. So I've suggested that, you know, sort of outright banning Chinese social media companies from the U.S. It could be justified on grounds of reciprocity. American companies can't operate in China in the social media space, but if we're going to allow them in, then I think that we need to create mechanisms to provide greater reassurance. The current deal that is being negotiated between ByteDance and Oracle and Walmart is one type of potential model for how to provide greater reassurance so that Americans can feel that Chinese social media companies, others that handle data, that data wouldn't just automatically be shared with Chinese authorities or abused in some other way, or that the content would be manipulated in a way that just serves the Chinese state. So providing some amount of corporate control to an American entity, providing some operational control and insights from Americans into the source code or equipment, reassurances over where the data is stored so it's not accessible by Chinese authorities, and commitments over content management. I think that is really sort of what the bigger picture of this TikTok arrangement could mean. And so it's not ideal. It's certainly not free market. And I sympathize with those who are worried that the US and others are responding to the Chinese in a way in which gives up our commitment to free markets. But it's a real challenge. I think we have to say that that a libertarian sort of stand back and just watch what happens approach isn't going to solve this problem. May soothe our ideologies, but doesn't really address the issue. And so I think the U.S. is going to need to be more forward-leaning as the world is, and come up with creative solutions so that if you don't want decoupling, if you don't want the world to split into two or fragment, we're going to have to come up with rules and principles and mechanisms to manage this type of interdependence in a way that allows us to preserve important elements of our society.
Thank you. We have a very large number of excellent questions. We're coming up on a hard stop at 10 o'clock. Do we have time for one more?
For sure. Absolutely, David.
Can Huawei sustain its 5G lead if the United States doubles down on its chip supply ban?
Short answer is likely no. If the U.S. really continues to implement the restrictions about supplies to Huawei and broadens it more comprehensively to SMIC and any manufacturer of chips, whether they're in Taiwan like TSMC or SMIC or others, then it really would cut off Huawei's ability to provide 5G telecom equipment and related technologies. That doesn't mean that no one in China could do it, but it would really slow down Huawei. So I do think that the U.S. in the short term really can deeply damage Huawei and China's 5G ambitions. I just don't know if this is the way the U.S. ought to go about dealing with the tech challenge from China on an economic and national security basis. But certainly, if this is what the U.S. decided to do and sticks with it, the results would for Huawei would not be good.
Scott Kennedy, thank you so much for this terrific presentation. All of our listeners are giving you a virtual round of applause, which is not audible, but still heartfelt. For all of you who participated, thank you so much for being with us. Again, your patronage and subscriptions make Asia Times possible. So if you have not already subscribed, please do so. Dr. Kennedy, again, many thanks and have a wonderful day. Thank you. We're now going to end the meeting.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.